In this next section, we're going to be looking at the issue of land and property and how some U.S. policies have allowed for greater asset building and acquisition of wealth for certain groups. When we start to consider who has resources and who does not, we have to consider the issue of economic wealth. We can't do that without understanding how land ownership has often conferred wealth to the average American. I'm not talking about the super rich here, who often has capitalized on economic advantage through leveraging assets in the corporate world, or, as we've seen more recently, the area of technology or intellectual property. But as we've said previously in this course, the average person in our country has acquired their own wealth through some kind of inheritance. And understand that there are several important aspects to land ownership, not all financial. Land provides a safe place, it's a buffer zone from the rest of the world, and it can provide social support, empowerment, and opportunity. In general, there are two primary ways that white Americans have been able to maintain wealth, power, and land ownership. The first is inheritance. It's typically things like titles, debts, assets, or property that's passed on to an individual or a group of people after the death of the owner. And the second is what's called an in vivo transfer, and that's typically gifts that are given to adult children from their living parents. To break that point down even further, most of the wealth in the white community comes from the transfer of assets from the older to the younger generation. And if you think about the history of policies in the U.S. regarding land, we can start to understand how certain groups of people were not able to institute widespread generational wealth, and that has damaging effects on the generations to follow. When grandparents and great-grandparents have been prevented from accessing programs that would help them allow to build wealth and pass those assets down to their children, you can see how that creates unequal outcomes in the present day. So we start this discussion thinking about how the struggle over land and property creates the backdrop and history for today's racial relations. One basic idea that the text wants you to understand is the concept of precedent. That term refers to the idea that if there's a legal dispute, the courts will look to past cases to guide them on what to do. If there's a land dispute, the only way to change the ownership of the land legally is to get a legal judgment. All land ownership is determined by the state or the federal government, depending on who has control of the land. Sure, you could take land by force and occupy it, but sooner or later the government would confer the property rights back to the legal owner. Now understand that with America being a British colony, much of the precedent upon which the U.S. built its legal system comes from the precedents created in Britain. So the Johnson case is a really old case. It happens in the U.S., but it's resolved through the British courts that were established in the colonies. In 1763, King George had set aside lands west of the Allegheny Mountains in West Virginia. He said the British colonists could not settle on that land, so the indigenous peoples could use it. So there's a land dispute, and what comes out of the case is something known as the discovery doctrine. This is the idea that a European power can gain what's known as radical title to the land that it discovers. The idea of radical title is now known as sovereignty. One little footnote to this story is that the whites laying claim to the land in the Johnson case were descendants of Thomas Jefferson. The outcome of this case, what you essentially need to know, is that the U.S. Supreme Court rules that the European settlers had what's known as a fee right, meaning that the land was legally owned by the government and that that land could be sold or conveyed by the government. Now you might want to ponder for a moment who discovered the land. The colonists claimed they discovered the land, so the rights to the land vested in their sovereignty, meaning the country of their citizenship. But who really discovered the land and owns it? Could you argue that the indigenous peoples discovered it well before the landing of the British colonists? But this case creates what's known as the Christian doctrine of discovery. The next step forward in history needs to consider the doctrine of tribal sovereignty. This allows Indian nations to have a tremendous amount of independence in governing themselves, as long as they are on tribal lands. More or less, it keeps the U.S. government from interfering with what happens on tribal lands. However, if there are not enough resources to solve the issues, then the U.S. government can step in. Also, the U.S. government can step in if a major crime occurs on a reservation. The Indian nations don't have a tremendous amount of resources, so the U.S. government may step in when there are serious issues. This kind of oversight creates a system of paternalism, meaning that there's an assumption that the group does not have the ability to deal with their own problems and that outsiders have to step in to help. There are a variety of issues that create tensions today for whites and Native Americans. One issue is the portrayal of Native Americans in the media, which have been, over the history of Hollywood, portrayed more often than not as violent, uneducated, and uncivilized. While movies in the past 2 decades have presented alternative images, there's a collective history of damaging portrayals. Another issue is the policy of forcible removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by Andrew Jackson, ordered the removal of native populations from state-owned regions through physical force if needed. During the office of the presidency, the removal of the Native American tribes from their lands was President Jackson's priority. The Trail of Tears refers to the forced relocation of Cherokee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. The most widely known relocation was that of the Cherokee Nation in 1838. These peoples were forced to march to their destination, overseen by state and local militias. Over 16,000 Cherokees were forced to march, and the estimates are that between 2,000 and 8,000 of these people perished on the way to their destinations.